It was just another evening in the city for Maya. She had finished a long day at work and was looking forward to relaxing at home. The streets were busy with people heading to their destinations, and the sun was starting to set, casting a soft orange glow over everything. As Maya walked toward her car parked on a quiet side street, she felt a sense of relief. The day was finally over, and she was ready to unwind. But just as she reached her car, a police siren blared behind her. Maya's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't doing anything wrong, but the sudden stop made her nervous. She turned around and saw a police patrol car pulling up behind her. A police officer got out, his uniform crisp and his face unreadable. "Excuse me, miss," he called out, walking toward her. "I need to talk to you for a moment." Maya froze for a second, trying to stay calm. She had never been in trouble with the police before, so she wasn't sure what was going on. "Is something wrong, officer?" she asked politely, hoping for a simple explanation. The officer didn't respond kindly. Instead, he took a step closer, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. "You look suspicious," he said in a tone that sent a chill through her. Maya tried to keep her voice steady as she explained, "I'm just going home, officer. I'm not doing anything wrong." But the officer seemed to ignore her words. He raised his hand, signaling her to step aside. "I'm going to need you to stay where you are," he ordered, his voice firm and unyielding. Maya's heart began to race. She felt a sudden unease, the way his tone had shifted from calm to harsh in seconds. But she didn't want to argue. She nodded, trying to stay composed. She didn't want to escalate things. "Okay, officer," she said, stepping back slightly, hoping he would soon let her go on her way. But things weren't going to end that easily. The officer took another step forward, his eyes narrowing. "You're not listening," he said, his voice rising now. "I'm asking you to stay right here." Maya felt a sudden tension in the air. Something didn't feel right. She had never been treated this way by an officer before. She felt trapped, and her mind raced for a solution. "I'm just trying to go home," she said again, trying to keep the situation calm. Instead of responding, the officer moved closer and put his hands on her shoulders, guiding her roughly to the side of the car. Maya was taken aback, her fear growing as she tried to pull away. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice shaking. She had never experienced anything like this, and the officer's behavior was starting to feel more threatening by the second. "Stay still," he commanded. Maya's breath quickened. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. What was happening? Why was he treating her like this? Before she could process the situation any further, the officer grabbed her arm and roughly shoved her into the back of his patrol car. She gasped, unable to believe what was happening. "No," she cried out, but it was too late. The officer slammed the trunk closed, leaving her in the dark confines of the car, unable to move or speak. Her mind raced. What had she done to deserve this? She thought back to her peaceful day, to the hopes of a quiet night. Now, everything had changed in an instant. Maya could feel the heat rising in her chest as she lay cramped in the trunk of the police car. It was hard to breathe with the air so tight around her, and the metallic smell of the trunk filled her nostrils. She had been shoved in here with no explanation, no reason at all. She couldn't understand why the officer had done this to her, and her mind raced as she tried to process everything. Why was she being treated like this? The sound of the officer's footsteps faded, and Maya's heart pounded in her chest. Was he really going to leave her here? She pressed her hands against the cold metal, trying to calm herself. She needed to think clearly. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some kind of misunderstanding, right? Outside, the sounds of traffic and city life seemed distant, muffled by the walls of the trunk. Maya felt trapped. The officer's voice echoed in her mind, harsh and unrelenting. "Stay still." But how could she stay still when everything felt so wrong? For what felt like an eternity, she stayed in the darkness, trying not to panic. Every noise outside made her jump. She could hear people walking past, cars driving by, but no one seemed to notice her or care. Maya wondered if anyone had even seen what happened. Would anyone speak up for her? Or was she just another person being ignored? Then, suddenly, the sound of footsteps returned, this time closer and heavier. Maya's heart skipped a beat as she tried to steady her breathing. What was happening now? The officer's voice broke through the quiet. "You're not going anywhere." Got it. The words were sharp, like a command, not a question. Maya felt a chill go down her spine. The tension in the air had become thick, and she could sense the officer's anger growing. What was his problem? Why was he treating her like this? Maya tried to stay calm, but it wasn't easy. She needed to get out of there. She needed to figure out what was going on. Her mind raced again. There had to be a way out of this. She had to stay strong. She heard the officer walk around the car, his boots tapping on the pavement as he made his way to the front. For a moment, she thought he might open the trunk again, but instead, there was silence. Maya pressed her ear against the metal, straining to hear anything that could give her a clue about what was happening next. Then, the officer's voice came from the front of the car again, but this time it sounded different. He was speaking on his radio, his tone suddenly changing to a more professional one. Maya could barely make out the words, but she could tell that he was calling in for something. Was he asking for backup, or was he reporting the situation? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car engine revving nearby. Maya's heart leaped. Could it be someone coming to help her, or was it just another passing vehicle? She hoped, more than anything, that someone had noticed what was going on, but there was no way to know for sure. As the seconds stretched into minutes, Maya's thoughts began to turn to her family, her brother in particular. What would he say if he knew what was happening? Would he come to her rescue? The thought of him fighting for her made her feel a little bit stronger, like she wasn't completely alone. But in the dark, with nothing but the cold metal and silence surrounding her, Maya realized that she would have to face this moment alone, at least for now. She had no idea how long she would be stuck in that trunk or what would happen next. But one thing was for sure, she wasn't going to give up. Not without a fight. As the minutes ticked by, Maya lay still in the trunk, trying to stay as calm as possible despite the growing anxiety in her chest. She could hear voices and footsteps outside, but everything felt distant, as though she was in a world of her own. The car's engine hummed softly, and the sound of passing cars added to the tension. Her heart raced with every passing second. Through the darkness, Maya tried to make sense of what had happened. Why had the officer acted so aggressively? What was it about her that had made him treat her this way? She had done nothing wrong. She was just a woman trying to get home after a long day at work. But now she was trapped, helpless in the back of a police car. And the world outside seemed to be moving on without her. She could hear the sounds of people walking by, some laughing, others talking. It sounded like a normal evening in the city. But then something caught her attention, something she hadn't expected. Maya heard a group of people pass by, their voices low but filled with concern. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Were they talking about her? Maya felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe someone had seen what happened. Maybe someone would step in and help. She pressed her ear against the trunk, straining to hear. But the voices grew quieter as the group walked away. A sinking feeling settled in her stomach as the realization hit her. No one was going to help her. They had all just walked past, ignoring her. The silence that followed was deafening. Maya felt small and insignificant, trapped in a situation where no one seemed to care. She had always heard stories of people standing up for each other, of bystanders stepping in when they saw something wrong. But now, as she lay in the dark, she realized that the world wasn't always so kind. Sometimes people looked away, afraid of getting involved or facing consequences. She shook her head, trying to push away the feeling of helplessness. She couldn't let this be the end of the story. Maya had always believed that kindness and justice were worth fighting for, but at this moment, it felt like those things were in short supply. She had to rely on herself, on her own strength. For a brief moment, she considered screaming out for help, but the thought quickly faded. She didn't want to make the situation worse. What if the officer heard her? What if he came back and got angrier? No, she had to be smart. She had to wait for the right moment. The officer had gone quiet, and Maya assumed he was still at the front of the car, talking to someone on his radio. She tried to focus on the sound of his voice, but it was hard to hear clearly from where she was. The darkness around her was thick, and her thoughts kept spiraling. She couldn't help but wonder if there was anyone out there who would help her. Why hadn't anyone intervened yet? Despite the discouraging silence, Maya held on to a small flicker of hope. She wasn't alone. Somewhere, someone cared about her. She thought about her family, especially her brother. He was the one person who would never ignore her. He would come for her, no matter what. The thought of him gave her strength, and she knew she couldn't give up now. The minutes passed slowly, but Maya kept her focus sharp. She would find a way out of this. She wouldn't let fear control her. There had to be a way for someone to see that she needed help, even if no one had noticed yet. And when the time came, she would make sure that the officer faced the consequences of his actions. She wasn't going to let this moment define her. She was going to fight for herself, and for anyone who needed help in the future. Maya's heart was still racing, and every second seemed to stretch into eternity. She felt the cold metal pressing against her, the darkness closing in on her thoughts. The weight of her situation was overwhelming, but just when it felt like she couldn't take it any longer, something unexpected happened. Her phone, which she had tucked into her pocket earlier that evening, buzzed. At first, Maya wasn't sure if it was real or just a dream. She held her breath, listening for any sound that might indicate her phone's vibrations were real. And then it buzzed again. Maya's fingers fumbled in the darkness as she pulled it out of her pocket, and her thumb slid across the screen to unlock it. The screen flashed, and Maya's breath caught in her throat. It was her brother, Jordan. Without thinking, she answered the call, her voice shaky. "Jordan, help me. I'm in trouble. There's a cop. He locked me in the trunk of his car." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Maya could hear a low hum in the background, and then her brother's voice came through, calm but filled with concern. "Maya, where are you? What happened?" "I don't know. I'm not sure where I am, but I'm in a patrol car, and he won't let me out. I didn't do anything wrong. I swear I didn't do anything." Maya's voice cracked, and she felt a lump form in her throat. The panic threatened to swallow her again, but she pushed it back, trying to stay focused. Jordan's voice was steady, but Maya could hear the anger in his words. "Hold on, Maya. I'm coming. Stay calm. Don't hang up, okay? I'm getting help." Maya tried to steady her breathing. "Please, Jordan. Please hurry. I don't know how much longer I can take this. Stay with me, sis. I'm coming," he said, his voice firm and reassuring. The sound of his words brought a flicker of hope to Maya, a small light in the dark. She knew he would come for her. He always did, no matter what. But still, the thought of being trapped like this, with no one else around to help, made her feel small and vulnerable. "I'm scared," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. It was the truth, but it felt strange to admit it. She had always been strong, always the one to take care of others. But now she was the one who needed saving. Jordan's response was immediate, strong, and full of determination. "I know you are, Maya, but I need you to trust me, okay? Stay strong for me. I'm coming, and I'm not going to let anything happen to you." Maya nodded even though she knew he couldn't see it. "Okay," she whispered, feeling a little steadier. The idea that her brother was on his way to help gave her the courage to keep fighting. She wasn't alone in this. She had him, and that was all that mattered. "I've got a plan," Jordan continued. "I'm calling in some friends and getting the right people on this. Just hold on a little longer. I'm going to get you out of there." Maya swallowed hard, her emotions swirling. She could hear the sound of Jordan's voice through the phone, and it was a lifeline she clung to. It was the only thing keeping her from breaking down. "I'm so sorry, Maya," Jordan added, his voice softer now. "I should have been there sooner." "No, Jordan, you didn't know," Maya replied quickly. "You couldn't have known. But I'm okay. I'm going to be okay." Even though her words were filled with uncertainty, Maya tried to believe them. She had to. For herself. And for Jordan. Maya sat in the dark, her thoughts swirling in the confined space of the trunk. The minutes felt like hours. The buzzing of her phone was the only thing that kept her connected to the outside world, and even though her brother, Jordan, was on his way, she couldn't shake the fear that gripped her heart. What if the officer came back before Jordan arrived? What would happen then? She focused on her breathing, trying to calm herself, but it wasn't easy. Her mind raced as she thought about everything that had happened. Why had the officer treated her this way? Why hadn't anyone stepped in when they saw her struggling? She had never felt so alone in her life. The fear of the unknown wrapped itself tightly around her, but somewhere deep inside, she felt a spark of determination. Maya refused to let fear control her. She had to stay strong, for herself and for the people who cared about her. She had spent her life standing up for what was right, and this situation wasn't going to be any different. She was not going to let this officer's cruelty define her or her future. Her thoughts turned to her brother again. Jordan had always been there for her. He was the one person who never hesitated to help, no matter the situation. Maya knew that he wouldn't stop until he found her. He was relentless when it came to protecting his family. That thought alone gave her the strength to hold on. If anyone could bring justice to this situation, it was Jordan. But she couldn't wait forever. Maya needed to take action. Even though she was trapped in the trunk, she wasn't completely powerless. Her phone buzzed again, and she quickly picked it up, hoping to hear from Jordan. It was a text message this time. "I'm on my way. I've called a few people to help. Stay calm." Maya felt a wave of relief wash over her. He was close. He had a plan. She wasn't alone after all. He had already reached out to the people who could make a difference, and that gave her hope. But it also sparked something else inside her, a strong desire for justice. She wasn't just going to wait to be rescued. She needed to make sure this officer was held accountable for what he had done. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that she couldn't let this go. Not for herself, and not for anyone else who might find themselves in a similar situation. As her mind raced, Maya realized that this was bigger than just her. It was about standing up against injustice. It was about making sure that people like this officer couldn't get away with their actions. It was about showing the world that there were people who cared, people who would fight for what was right, even in the face of fear. Her brother's message reminded her that change didn't happen overnight. It took people coming together, standing up, and making their voices heard. Maya wasn't just a victim in this situation. She was going to be part of the solution. As she held on to the hope that Jordan would soon be there, Maya made a promise to herself. This wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. She would stand tall, no matter what happened next. And when the time came, she would fight for justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who needed someone to speak up for them. The officer's actions would not go unanswered. Maya was ready to make sure of it. The minutes seemed to crawl by as Maya sat in the trunk, still unsure of what was going to happen next. She kept her phone clutched in her hand, the screen dimmed, hoping that every vibration or ping would be a message from Jordan, letting her know that he was close. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, but one thing stood out. She couldn't sit here forever, trapped and helpless. Maya's heart skipped a beat when she heard footsteps again, this time closer and more urgent. The officer's boots clattered on the pavement, and Maya immediately stiffened, her breath shallow. She wasn't sure if he was just walking by or coming to check on her, but she could feel his presence getting closer. Her grip on the phone tightened as she braced herself. What was he going to do? Would he let her out, or was he planning something else? Suddenly, the trunk popped open. The bright streetlights poured in, momentarily blinding Maya as she blinked to adjust. She squinted, trying to make out the figure standing above her. It was the officer, looking down at her with a cold, emotionless expression. Maya's pulse raced as she tried to sit up, but the trunk was cramped, and she could hardly move. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice shaking, but trying to sound stronger than she felt. "Why am I here? I've done nothing wrong." The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at her, his gaze hard. There was a moment of silence, and Maya could feel the tension building. She had no idea what was going through his mind, but she knew she couldn't back down now. The officer finally spoke, his voice flat. "You're not going anywhere yet. You need to stay where you are." Maya didn't know how much more she could take. The officer's refusal to explain himself made everything more confusing. "You don't have the right to do this. You can't just throw me in the trunk like an animal," she said, her voice firm despite the fear she was feeling. He stepped back slightly, as though considering her words. But instead of answering, he reached for the radio on his belt and began speaking to someone, his voice low and clipped. Maya couldn't hear the conversation clearly, but it only lasted a few moments before he turned back to her. "I've called in," he said, a faint trace of annoyance in his tone. "You'll be dealt with soon." Maya's mind raced. He had just called for backup, but for what? Was he expecting more trouble? Or was this his way of intimidating her into silence? She wasn't sure, but the fear she felt earlier was being replaced by something else. Determination. She wouldn't let him get away with this. Not without a fight. Just as Maya was about to speak again, she heard a car engine in the distance. The sound was faint at first, but it grew louder, the unmistakable hum of an approaching vehicle. Her heart soared. It was Jordan. He had arrived. Maya's relief was almost overwhelming. She knew her brother wouldn't let her down, and now the situation was about to change. She took a deep breath, holding on to the hope that he would be able to make things right. As the car drew closer, Maya's focus remained on the officer in front of her. He hadn't noticed yet, but she could see the look in his eyes as he turned toward the noise. He was distracted. And that was the moment Maya had been waiting for. The officer's grip on the situation was slipping. She wasn't alone anymore, and she knew that soon justice would come. Her brother would make sure of it. The officer's gaze flickered, and Maya knew it was time. As she waited for the confrontation to unfold, one thing was clear. This moment wasn't just about her. It was about standing up for what was right. And she wasn't going to let anyone take that away. Maya felt the tension in the air as the officer turned his attention away from her and toward the distant sound of the approaching car. The engine roared louder with each passing second. Her heart skipped a beat. It was Jordan. He was finally here. But the officer didn't seem to notice just how close Jordan had gotten. He continued to stand there, his face unreadable, as if he were waiting for something to happen. Maya's thoughts were racing. She had no idea what was going to unfold, but she knew that everything was about to change. Jordan's car came to a stop a few feet away from the patrol vehicle. Maya could feel her breath catching in her throat. This was it. Her brother was here, and he wasn't going to let this officer get away with what he had done. Maya's eyes locked with the officer's, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her mind screaming for action. But Jordan's calm, steady approach seemed to freeze everything in its tracks. The officer looked over at the car, then back at Maya. His face was no longer as confident as it had been before. There was a shift in the air, something that Maya couldn't quite place. Was it fear? Was it uncertainty? For the first time, the officer seemed to hesitate. He took a step back, his hand hovering near his belt as if unsure of what to do next. The sound of Jordan's footsteps as he stepped out of the car was the only thing that broke the silence. Maya's brother was walking toward them with purpose, his expression serious but calm. The officer's eyes flickered nervously, and Maya noticed a subtle change in his posture. The confidence he had earlier was slipping away. It was as though the reality of the situation was finally sinking in. The officer had been in control, or so he thought, but now he was facing something he wasn't prepared for. "Officer, what's going on here?" Jordan's voice cut through the air, strong and clear. He stood tall, unwavering in the face of the officer's uncertain gaze. "Why is my sister in the trunk of your car?" The officer opened his mouth as if to respond, but his words were caught in his throat. He was suddenly speechless, the words failing him. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes darting between Jordan and Maya, unsure of what to say. Maya watched as the officer's confidence completely faltered. His hand slowly moved away from his belt, his posture slumping slightly. He was no longer the intimidating figure he had been moments before. Instead, he looked lost, like someone who had suddenly realized the mistake they'd made. Jordan didn't move, didn't blink. He kept his gaze locked on the officer, his presence commanding the attention of the entire scene. It was clear that Jordan wasn't backing down, and neither was Maya. The officer stood there, frozen. His authority had disappeared in the face of Jordan's calm determination. The power he had held moments ago, the power he had used to push Maya into the trunk, had evaporated. He had no answers, no justification, and no way to explain what had happened. Maya felt a surge of relief wash over her. She wasn't alone anymore. Her brother had arrived, and together they were going to make sure that the officer faced the consequences for his actions. The officer's silence spoke volumes. The once confident cop had been reduced to someone who couldn't find the words to defend what he had done. For the first time since the whole ordeal had begun, Maya felt a small spark of hope. Justice was no longer out of reach. With Jordan by her side, the officer's actions were about to be exposed. This moment was not just about Maya's freedom. It was about standing up for what was right, and it was clear that the officer had lost the upper hand. Maya's heart slowed as she realized that her nightmare was finally over. But it wasn't just the end for her. It was the beginning of a new fight, a fight for justice. And she wasn't going to stop until the officer was held accountable for his actions. The officer stood there, still frozen, as Maya and Jordan exchanged a brief glance. Maya could feel her brother's protective gaze on her, and she knew that he was making sure everything would be okay. The tension in the air was thick, but it wasn't just the officer who was caught in it. This was a moment that would shape everything that came next. Jordan took a steady step forward, his voice calm but filled with authority. "You need to explain yourself," he said, his words hanging in the air. "You can't just treat people like this. Not without consequences." The officer seemed to snap out of his daze for a moment, his eyes darting to the ground. He didn't respond immediately. His hands were still slightly raised, but he no longer seemed sure of himself. Maya watched as the reality of the situation hit him. There was no getting away from it now. "I didn't mean..." The officer stammered, but his words were lost in the tension. His eyes shifted between Jordan and Maya, and he looked like he was struggling to find a way out of the mess he had created. But there was no way out now. His actions had been witnessed, and there was no denying the truth of what had happened. Maya stepped forward, her voice steady despite everything she had been through. "You can't just shove someone into the back of a car like that. I've done nothing wrong. You had no reason to treat me like that." Jordan's protective stance didn't waver as he nodded in agreement. "That's right. And you will be held accountable for what you did. You can't get away with this." The officer's face turned pale, and he seemed to shrink under the weight of their words. It was clear that he hadn't expected to be confronted like this. He was used to being in control, used to others fearing him. But now he was the one who was afraid. He had no way of defending his actions. In that moment, Jordan's calm determination took control. "I'm calling the right people. This is going to be reported. You're not going to get away with what you've done," he said firmly, his eyes locked on the officer's. Maya could feel her anxiety lifting. Jordan had taken charge of the situation, and she knew he was going to make sure the officer would face consequences for what had happened. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about making sure this didn't happen to anyone else. Jordan took out his phone and quickly dialed a number. "I need to report an incident," he said as soon as the call was answered. "A police officer unlawfully detained my sister. I need immediate assistance." Maya stood quietly by his side, watching as the events unfolded. She felt a sense of strength in her brother's actions. He wasn't just standing up for her. He was standing up for the right thing. He was making sure the officer knew that what he had done was wrong, and that it wouldn't be swept under the rug. The sound of sirens grew closer, and within minutes, another police vehicle pulled up. Maya could feel the change in the air, a sense that the tables had finally turned. Officers got out of the car, and their eyes went straight to the officer who had detained Maya. There was no more room for denial. Jordan spoke to the new officers, explaining what had happened. They listened carefully, taking notes. Maya could see the shift in their demeanor as they turned their attention to the officer who had mistreated her. It was clear that they weren't going to let this slide. The officer who had detained Maya stood there, his face flushed with embarrassment and fear. He knew he had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. He had been caught, and the consequences were already in motion. As the new officers took control of the situation, Maya felt a sense of relief wash over her. The officer who had abused his power would face justice, and she would no longer be trapped by his actions. Her brother had made sure of that. Maya realized that this moment wasn't just about her. It was about standing up for what was right, about making sure that people who misused their authority would be held accountable. As she watched the officers handle the situation, she knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger change. And for the first time that night, Maya could finally breathe easy. The sounds of the officers talking and taking notes faded into the background as Maya stood there with Jordan. It had all happened so quickly. The tension, the fear, the unexpected arrival of her brother. And now, it seemed like everything was finally falling into place. The officer who had locked her in the trunk was no longer in charge of the situation. His actions had been exposed, and he would have to face the consequences. Maya stood next to Jordan, feeling the weight of everything that had happened slowly lift from her shoulders. The night that had started so uneventfully, with her just trying to get home after a long day, had turned into something much bigger. It was no longer just about her. It was about something much larger, standing up for what was right. Jordan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, a gesture that made her feel safe. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle but serious. Maya took a deep breath and nodded. "I will be," she said, her voice steady now. "I think I just needed to hear someone tell me that everything was going to be okay." Jordan smiled, but there was something more in his eyes, something like understanding, like he knew exactly what she had been through. "I'm proud of you, Maya," he said quietly. "You didn't back down, and that takes real strength." Maya's eyes stung, and she quickly blinked the tears away. She hadn't realized just how much she needed to hear those words. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said, her voice a little thicker now. "I was scared, but when I heard your voice on the phone, I knew I wasn't alone." The officers who had arrived as backup continued to question the officer who had detained Maya, asking him to explain his actions. They were professional, calm, but there was no mistaking the seriousness of the situation. The officer who had abused his power was no longer in control. Maya could see that this time, the system was going to work the way it should. As the situation was wrapped up, one of the officers came over to Maya and Jordan. "Thank you for your patience," the officer said. "We're taking this seriously, and the proper steps will be taken." Maya nodded, still trying to process everything. She had never expected her quiet evening to end like this, but as she looked at Jordan, she realized that this moment had become an important one. It wasn't just about what had happened to her. It was about standing up to injustice and knowing that it was okay to demand better. "I hope this never happens to anyone again," she said quietly, looking at the officers and then back at Jordan. "No one should feel like they don't matter." Jordan gave her a nod of agreement. "You're right, Maya. And your voice made sure this one won't be ignored. You stood up for yourself, and that's what really matters." The officer who had wrongfully detained Maya was led away by his colleagues, his career clearly over. Maya watched as he was taken, feeling a sense of justice settling in her heart. It wasn't just about him. It was about the bigger picture. The world could be a better place if people spoke up when things went wrong, if they refused to stay silent in the face of unfairness. Maya had learned that tonight. As Jordan walked with her to the car, the two of them didn't speak much. There were no words needed. What had happened was done, but it had left an impact on both of them. Maya was changed, not just by the ordeal, but by the way she had handled it. She had faced something terrifying, but she had also found a new strength in herself. And as she sat down in the passenger seat of Jordan's car, feeling the cool night air rush through the open window, she knew one thing for sure. No matter what came next, she would always stand up for what was right, because that was the only way to make sure things truly changed.